Can you see it well? Just making sure. Okay, perfect. So, well, welcome to this discussion. We'll be introducing you to degrowth in the time of COVID-19. So we decided to divide this discussion in three main parts. The first one will be on why is degrowth opposed to the notion of growing economies. Then we'll go on with what are the key principles to degrowth. And we'll end up with a discussion about what is needed to do to engage in a degrowth transformation. So we're very much looking forward to discussion with you at the end. So let's dive directly into the topic. What is degrowth? So degrowth is a theoretical framework, but it's also a social movement and a political agenda. It emerged at the end of the 20th century, and it's basically at the same time as there is a growing discussion and critiques of growing economies, especially with the report Limits to Growth in 1972. There is a discussion, debate at that time around the sustainability of consumerist societies, about an equal power relationship between and within countries. So degrowth emerges and evolves at that time in parallel and in connection with the field and research of political ecology, of ecological economics, of environmental justice, amongst others. So I will read here the definition that we worked on at our team at Degrowth.info. So degrowth is an idea that critiques the global capitalist system, which pursues growth at all costs, causing human exploitation and environmental destruction. The degrowth movement of activists and researchers advocates for societies that prioritize social and ecological well-being instead of corporate profits, overproduction, and excess consumption. So this requires radical redistribution, reduction in the material size of the global economy, and a shift in common values towards care, solidarity, and autonomy. Degrowth means transforming societies to ensure environmental justice and a good life for all within planetary boundaries. So it's important to notice here in this definition that degrowth is not only about the economy, it is not an economic theory, it is transdisciplinary. It includes both researchers and activists. And the objective is not this, there is a common idea that degrowth is about decreasing the GDP. So we can see here in this graph that it is not about decreasing the GDP. So growth is more of the same, as we can see here with the elephant. The stationary state would be same of the same, and then decreasing GDP would be less of the same. So it's called a recession. It's not called degrowth. So degrowth is about doing things differently. It's about imagining a different system. So GDP in this case would inevitably decline, but that would be an outcome of sustainable degrowth. That would not be the objective. Now we'll let Nick go on with the next slide.
Thank you, Joëlle. Okay, so I'm going to get you started with the growth criticisms. So if we look at the COVID-19 responses that are being discussed in terms of policy all over the world, we see that they're all growth oriented. And that is not surprising because we're used to thinking that growth solves many of the social and ecological problems that we're seeing. And what we're going to do in this part is present you a range of criticisms that degrowth is based on. And we divide that in three categories. And I'm going to get you started with ecology. So next slide, please. Thanks. So this basically builds on the popular sentence that we cannot have an infinite economic growth on a planet which has finite resources. And what we're seeing is that globally, economic growth always comes with an increasing use of materials and energy, and that goes along with an increase in CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases. So really what we're seeing is that environmental pressures go up as GDP goes up. And now the question is, can we decouple the two? And that's what we're seeing here in this graphic. There's relative decoupling on the left. So both environmental pressures, that's the green arrow, and GDP in orange still increase, but environmental pressures relatively less so? Or would it even be possible, and that's on the right-hand side, to have an absolute decoupling of the two? And there's a fierce debate around whether or not this is possible. And the degrowth position on this is that in the past, we have never seen anything close to the absolute decoupling that would be needed in the very near future in an unheard of scale to actually meet the challenges that we are facing in terms of loss of biodiversity, of climate change, and so on. And that brings me to the next criticism. So next slide, thank you. About the question of well-being, because basically growth not only has a lot of damaging potential or comes with a lot of damage to the environment, at least in the global north, we can also argue that it's not really necessary. So the core thesis of the well-being argument is that additional economic growth in the global north does not increase well-being any further. What we are seeing in research is that quality of life depends on other factors. So, for example, sense of freedom, which in turn has a lot to do with the social tolerance in the society that you're happening to live in. Other factors are equality, democracy, time prosperity. So how much leisure time do you have and how are you allowed to spend it? Appreciation of care work, environmental quality, and other factors. And so in empirical studies, we see that there's something like a threshold between the social and ecological costs of growth and the benefits associated with growth. And beyond a certain threshold, the costs are higher than the benefits. And we will talk in a minute about the justice implications that this has, because below that threshold, and that is more about the global south, then below that threshold, we see significant improvements of well-being in us that come with additional growth measured as GDP. And Joëlle will talk to that in a minute.
Yes, so I will talk about this last question of why is growth not a solution, and it's a question of justice. So there is, here I will talk about the justice towards the next generations, the justice towards the current generations, and the justice towards non-human nature. So the first one is the justice towards the next generation. So this would require that we do not exhaust resources today that could be vital for survival and a decent quality of life to the generations of humans that come after us. So if we cannot succeed, as Nick was explaining, if we cannot succeed the absolute decoupling, then it means that we are taking from the next generation's resources. So we need to leave for justice, we need to live current ecosystems intact for those generations. The second one is the justice towards the current generations, and more specifically, those suffering the worst effect of the ecological crisis today. And we know that this is in general not in the Western world, but even more so in the global South. So this would require a radical redistribution of wealth, both locally and globally. But the current model of growing capitalist economies is based on the principle of profit maximization and the accumulation of capital. So redistribution of wealth in this model is supposed to happen naturally through the trickle-down effect. I guess you've already heard of that. So the increases in profits eventually benefits everyone. But inequalities have increased at a fast pace across the globe in the last decades, and especially since the pandemic. So from March to December 2020, the global billionaires' wealth increased by $3.9 trillion. By contrast, global workers' combined earnings fell by 3.7 trillion. So you do the math. So money is not trickling down, it is accumulating in the hands of the few. And that's precisely what capitalist economies were designed to do. So growing economies are serving the interest of capital because they only value productivity. And that explains why large parts of society are not visible in the numbers of the economy, particularly the unpaid and low-paid sectors, and that encompasses almost all care and reproductive work. So that results in the underrepresentation in the economy of the marginalized groups that are overrepresented in these types of work, in the care and reproductive work. So women, BIPOC population, members of the LGBTQ plus community. So this means that when we're talking about how to restart the economy after a crisis, the sectors that will be favored are the ones that are known to have the largest impact on the economy. And we've seen this with this pandemic because public funds have been used to bail out very large corporations. So investing in care, health, or education is not interesting in terms of productivity of capital and does not have the power to restart the economy as it is designed now. So it's also not really surprising that these are also always the first sectors targeted by austerity policies. The last point on justice that I will mention is the justice towards non-human nature. So again, if we're not succeeding this decoupling, it means that we are destroying ecosystem, and that is no justice towards non-human nature. So productivist, expansionist, growing economies are not only based on the exploitation of humans, but also of non-human nature. And in the past 50 years, human activities have triggered changes to ecosystems that were more rapid than at any time in history, and the rates of biodiversity loss do not show any sign of slowing down. So in this first part, we wanted to give you a short overview of the arguments that exist against economies based on growth. And as we have seen, this is not only a question of ecological sustainability, but it's also a question of well-being and justice. So basing post-COVID recovery on growth policies will not fix the social and ecological problems we are facing because it is precisely not dealing with the fundamental causes of the ongoing crisis. Now we will continue with the second part, which is rethinking the foundation of our economies, because degrowth is not only offering a critique of the capitalist growth paradigm, as we just discussed, but it is also and mainly a positive vision of the world. So now we'll discuss some of these key principles in degrowth and how these are challenging the foundation of our societies. So we'll start with the first one, that is voluntary simplicity, and I haven't written it here, but it's also decommodification. I kind of like put the two together. And this concept of voluntary simplicity comes in contrast with the culture of higher, faster, better, and it emphasizes the need to slow down our lives and our societies and instead focus on the essentials. So in the current system, meeting our basic needs depend mostly on monetary transactions. So we need to pay for education, for health, for food. So slowing down in such a system, for example, by working less, which also implies earning less, is not really possible for the majority of people. But working less also means having more time for other essential activities, such as taking care of our families and communities, as growing our food, participating politically, engaging in artistic projects, and having then our basic needs met not through the market economy, but through the community. So being more independent from markets and more resilient within our communities. And the COVID-19 pandemic has put a halt to the fast pace of our society and has reminded us how much we depend on the provision of basic needs and how much access to these provisions is unequally distributed. So degrowth is proposing to reverse this trend of fast, profit-driven growing economies and target our action and policies towards ensuring that everyone's basic needs, so food, clothing, housing, health, are met without depending on market mechanisms. I give it over to Nick to talk about the next one.
Right, thanks, Joëlle. So the next one is conviviality, and that really speaks to the role of technology and of digitalization. And the main idea here is that modern tools are easy to access, are understandable and usable by all. So there's a minimum expertise required to use these tools. That also implies that they should be easy to repair and to adapt. And there are quite a couple of examples for this already these days, especially with digitalization. But it's a big departure of that idea that perfect technology can be the fix for the problems that we're seeing in terms of climate change. Another important aspect of conviviality is that machines should not be there to mainly replace human tasks, but instead foster cooperation and connection. So machines are mainly there to support human tasks, not replace them. The next one that I'll be talking about is autonomy. And there's already a link, because obviously the way conviviality is defined in terms of technology has a lot to do with autonomy of the people. So by autonomy, we mean that we should have the ability to give laws, rules, and norms to ourselves independently and consciously within our communities. So this is really a question, again, of self-determination, which is community-based. And that also concerns the economy. So degrowth, when thinking about how would the future of business look like, envisions rather smaller, locally embedded and cooperatively organized ways of doing business. So your cooperative would actually be a pretty good example of what that could look like. There's also other approaches that are being tested. And excuse me, and importantly, autonomy here does not mean insularity. So of course, cooperation beyond your community and centralization of power has a place within degrowth too. The point is here that as much as possible, power should be decentralized. And that brings me directly to the next point, which is democracy, because this kind of autonomy would necessarily involve more elements of direct democracy. So citizens should be able to participate continuously and directly in collective decision-making, especially if it affects them. And this obviously can go way beyond just decision-making, because decision-making is always embedded in a visionary process. And that ties back to the question of where do we want to go as a community? What is the good life that we are striving for? So fundamentally, the pillar of democracy here has to do with the decentralization of political and economic power. And with that, I give it over to Joëlle again.
Thank you, Nick. So the next one is the principle of care. And that's another very important principle in degrowth. And there is a lot of people working also on feminist degrowth that you can research on afterwards if you're interested. So care, what is care? Care refers to all the actions that humans accomplish daily for their own well-being and the well-being of their communities. And this care work is largely unpaid. And so that also implies that this work of subsistence and reproduction is undervalued and invisibilized because it is not accounted for in the productivity of the economy that we were talking about before. So degrowth calls for a more equitable distribution of care work across genders and classes, and mainly that requires rethinking what is considered productive in societies. Because if the basic things of taking care of our families is not considered productive, then of course it is not accounted for in the economy. And the last principle that we'll present here is the principle of solidarity. So here what we wanted to point out is that degrowth should not be understood as a new development paradigm that would aim at providing a solution for the vast diversity of realities and struggles that exist across the world. Instead, it stands in solidarity and alliance with many other approaches that act similarly as alternative post-development worldviews, and that together make up the emerging mosaic of alternatives. So there are people working on Buen Vivir in South America, on Ubuntu in South Africa, on ecological Swaraj in India, and so on and so on. So degrowth has a lot in common with those ideas, but is not trying to make as an umbrella above all of these other ideas. It works in coalition, in alliance with those other ideas that are proposing post-development views. So finally, we'll talk about the strategies for social ecological transformation. And in this part, we'll discuss 3 interconnected strategies that are inspired from Yves-Marie Abraham's proposal, so a researcher in Montreal. And it's produce less, share more, and decide together. So the first one is produce less. So in general, it is quite well accepted that we need to reduce globally our resource use and the ecological impact of our societies. But there is less agreement on how we should do this. So paradigms or concepts as green growth and sustainable development would propose to do this through decoupling, so we can separate environmental impact from economic growth. But degrowth argues, as Nick was presenting earlier, that this is not feasible nor likely, especially given the short time span that we have. So instead, we need to consume and produce less. But here it's important to notice that it does not mean that we should downscale everything and every sector. So it means developing and expanding some sectors like healthcare, education, renewable energy, ecological agriculture, while shrinking others like fossil fuel production, the military, the financial sector. So in other words, it is a transformation towards a care economy, a society that provides the material basis to sustain and regenerate life. So such a transformation requires ensuring that everyone, regardless of income or immigration status, has access to the provision of basic needs, as well as reducing working time and introducing machines for work sharing. I will let Nick present on the 2 left, the 2 others.
Right, thanks, Joëlle. I'm gonna start with decide together. So this obviously ties a lot into what was said before about democracy and autonomy. And I want to relate this again to the pandemic. So as with any crisis, we see an enormous increase in uncertainty right now. We see conspiracy theories on the rise. We see in many societies an increasing polarization. So obviously, this is a threat to democracy and a threat to the trust in the institutions that allow us to do exactly that, to decide together. And we think that a crisis, on the other hand, is also a great opportunity for change. And we really want to stress here that that change needs to be democratic. So, of course, when facing a pandemic, there are immediate steps to be taken. And that is a kind of situation where quick action is really important. But when we think about rebuilding a post-COVID world that would have any resemblance with what degrowth is calling for, this would have to be an inclusive and democratic process. And we actually see many examples around the world of people coming together and organizing in their community the provision of essential services that pretty much goes along with what degrowth is proposing. And there's also some examples from Germany and France that give us hope. For example, there have been civic councils in both countries that have been looking into policy proposals of how we could tackle climate change, and the proposals that were put forward by these councils were very, very progressive. And this is a very interesting development, and maybe we can pick this up in the discussion. Let me just talk about the final strategy here. So that's share more. And as you probably figured, this has to do with the inequalities that were mentioned by Joëlle before. So when I say inequalities, obviously this is both between and within countries. Just recall the example that Joëlle gave about the gains in wealth that the richest people in the US made compared to the loss of the workers. And what this shows clearly is that here we have not an issue of lacking money, but instead a concentration of money, a concentration of wealth, which obviously goes along with a concentration of power. So the measures that are put forward under the term degrowth try to address this and really go a long way to redistribute. This goes as far as demanding less private property and more commons-based governance schemes. The introduction of a minimum and a maximum income, which would of course have to be set in motion by a democratic process. The limitation of the financial sector, the taking back the control over monetary governance, the conducting of citizen debt audits, and the cancellation of public debt, especially so in the global south. And this again relates to the global inequalities that we were mentioning before, because the debt system perpetuates in many ways a system that is extremely disadvantageous to countries of the global south. Another measure that has received a lot of attention in Canada, as I understand, is guaranteed access to essential services. So universal basic services or universal basic income. And then I also want to point to a conversation that is taking place in the German-speaking degrowth debate, which is about how can we make public institutions of redistribution independent from growth. So the pension funds, for example, in Germany have in the way that they're set up inherently, there's this idea that the cookie to redistribute at the end of your work time grows all the time. So we have economic growth. And the question is now, how can we set up these institutional mechanisms so that they still work for everybody once this cookie no longer grows, which is also fairly interesting. All right, that was the last strategy. And with that, I will close. I think that, or I hope that we illustrated a bit to you that degrowth offers not the one silver bullet solution, but instead consists of a plurality of actions across all sectors and all levels. And from a research perspective, is also very, very plural. There's many different disciplines that look into this, and maybe we can talk a bit more about that in the discussion too. So I hope we could give you an idea of this diversity, and now we look forward to your reactions and questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick and Joëlle. So I'm just going to pull questions out of the chat and ask them. Sometimes I'll combine a few questions, but I'll start with Guillermo asks, is degrowth based only on past knowledge and experience, or can efficiency from new technologies also contribute to make things different with lower ecological footprints and maybe even a more fair access to opportunities across society. So, what can technological change? And I know that, a few years ago, people were very skeptical that technology could have a big impact, but we've seen solar prices drop like 90% or something in the last few years, and so there's some optimism around that. What are your thoughts on that?
I can take it. So technological change, that's a really good question, because this is what in general is argued by many people, is that technological change is advancing pretty fast, and so can be a solution to the challenges that we are facing. And what Degrowth is arguing in this is that, of course, technological change is important. We're not saying that we should not continue research on new ecological solutions, but that we should be more realistic towards how much this can actually bring the change. Because if we see the pace of technological change, actually it is not going fast enough to tackle the challenges that we are facing. And it is also not always targeted towards technological change. So there is a lot of technological change, but it is not especially an ecological new technology. Another argument here can be the rebound effect. So when we have a new energy efficiency improvement, we might think that this will allow us to reduce the amount of energy that we are using. So we think, oh, well, now we have this energy efficiency improvement, so now I can actually produce this much with this same level of energy. Or you can produce the same amount, but with less energy. But what actually happens is the rebound effect most of the time is that you will take this opportunity that you can actually produce more with the same level of energy that you were using before, thanks to the energy efficiency improvement. Or you can even backfire, so you can even increase the amount of energy, so you can increase even more your production. So in the end, more production still means more energy use and more resource use, so more ecological damage. So I don't know if that answers more or less to the question, or if Nick wants to.
Yeah, maybe I can just add one more thing. I think Joëlle said the most important things. I just really want to stress that that degrowth is not skeptical of technology per se, but really wants to emphasize the social embeddedness of technology. So technologies are great and they're super important, but we can't hope to rely on these technologies by themselves to solve the problems that we are facing. And I have a pretty good example to illustrate this with the rebound effect, because I'm currently finishing my master thesis, and it's actually on the rebound effect. And I'm looking at these effects in the context of community-supported agriculture. So community-supported agriculture, in a nutshell, is one way that a post-growth business could be organized. It's like a group of people who in solidarity decide to transfer a certain amount of money every month to a farmer, and the farmer in return gives them all the produce. So this is a way of production and exchange that is not intermediated by a market setting. And what I see in my research is that these rebound potentials don't actually materialize. So when there are savings, like Joëlle was saying, when there are savings for the production, these savings are then invested into other things, but they don't go into the continuing optimization or maximization of output. So that is quite interesting, and I think it illustrates quite well that technology definitely has a place as long as it adheres to what I was describing with the term conviviality.
Okay, great, thanks. So we've got a question from Daniel, and it says, what are the reasonable steps towards creating society-wide cultural change towards degrowth? what's the timeline on adopting degrowth, and how will we know that progress is being made towards real change on a grand scale? So what are the reasonable steps forward, the timeline, and how will we know we're making progress?
Maybe I can start. So in terms of the steps forward, this is actually a pretty big debate in the degrowth community right now. There's this whole debate around strategies. So how can we actually get from this very big, diverse pool of knowledge and ideas towards actual steps? And one classification of strategies that I know that I think is helpful is threefold. It's called reforms, activism, and realist utopias. So what that means is you take the first channel of the non-reformist reform, you try to go into the political system and gradually change by these reforms in a non-reformist way, because they are aimed towards something entirely different, to the snail, no more elephant. That's the first idea. Second idea, obviously, is activism. So that also is political engagement, but it's not within the boundaries of the political party system, but rather tries to change the discourse from an activist perspective. And then there's this whole idea of in a very small, specific local setting, enacting these ideas of what a degrowth society could look like, to show that it's possible, to inspire people by living by example. And these community-supported agriculture organizations that I was mentioning could be one example for that. Joëlle, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, sure. I think that's also a really interesting question. So I think about the cultural change, this is a big question. How do we bring about cultural change? And we have this notion that we call decolonizing our imaginary, because I think growth is something that is really embedded into our way of thinking. We have those common knowledge that we share in societies about, I don't know, people grow up thinking that women are less powerful than men, or, you grew up with those ideas that you need to deconstruct slowly. So I think by sharing ideas about degrowth, this is our way, I feel, of decolonizing our imaginary and trying to we grew up in a certain system, and trying to decolonize and imagine that it is actually possible to do differently in other systems. And I wanted to say something else about this. I think something, maybe a small anecdote from a friend from Croatia, who says that for him, actually, people in Croatia are much more open to ideas about degrowth because they haven't always grew up in a system that was a capitalist system. And so for them, when the system doesn't work, you change the system. And so I felt like that was really powerful, that when you're not in this same model since forever, then you can more easily think about other alternatives. And maybe I will just end with this notion again about plurality of ideas that exist in the world, that degrowth is one idea, is one way of decolonizing the imaginary. But in every part of the world, and even within Canada, Indigenous knowledge can also be another way of seeing the system differently. So I think this cultural change comes in many, many different ways, and is probably the biggest challenge, because this is something that is so embedded in our imaginary.
Great. So Nilakshi asks, well, essentially she's looking for some real world examples of degrowth. And Nick, you mentioned one, but are there one or two other real world experiments or examples of degrowth at a smaller scale that we could learn from?
So maybe I can share. I don't know if I would feel comfortable saying degrowth experiment, because I think many people do things without calling themselves degrowth, but do things that are very similar to degrowth values. So, for example, in Rojava, in the north of Syria, there is the community, the population is organizing in a very different way now. And there was this feminist revolution there, and they are organizing their society with socio-ecological values that are very much related to degrowth, but I would never say that this is a degrowth experiment, because I wouldn't put our name onto like their way of living. So I think there are people, I think the Zapatistas are also doing things very differently in Mexico, and can be also a community to be inspired from. But again, I don't think they would ever call themselves degrowth. So I don't know, Nick, if you have other examples of like people who maybe call themselves degrowth.
Yeah, so there's one project that that I actually lived in for something like a month, which is in southern France, and they call themselves Can de Crèche, which is Catalan. So Catalonia, as you probably know, is a region in Spain that borders on the French border, and this was, I think, initiated by people from the University of Barcelona, which is one of the academic hotspots for research on degrowth. And some people there set off to like really try to live these principles and experiment with these principles. And I'm gonna write the name of that project in the chat, because no way you're gonna find it by the way it's pronounced. And I'm also going to write in the chat, in case you're still interested in learning more about strategies. We had a really nice conference about strategies for degrowth transition in Vienna not so long ago. And most of the videos from that conference, it was in COVID times already, so everything is very well recorded. And we have most of that on YouTube, so I'm going to make sure you get that information.
Great, that works. There's a question here. Oh wait, I lost my spot. Oh yeah. Is there an example of any books or readings that you're particularly inspired by that you'd recommend for the group? And I'm sorry, I lost the name of the person who asked this question, but yeah, any particular things that you would recommend for people who want to learn more?
So I'm gonna start, Joëlle. There's really in the past 5 years, I would say, we've seen a burgeoning literature on degrowth. I feel like ever since I'm engaging with this topic, there's more and more being published on the topic, and I think a good way to get started could be the book is called Degrowth: A Vocabulary for a New Era, and it's really a glossary. So as you can probably tell, there are certain terms that we use in the degrowth community that have a very particular meaning, like conviviality, for example, like the decolonization of our imaginary, and all these terms there are explained in a very concise manner. So that was one that really helped me get into the debate. And I could think of others, but I'm going to let Joëlle go ahead and see what she suggests.
Yeah, there is. It's indeed, as Nick said, since I guess 2008 was the first conference, and since then it's been really impressive, the amount of literature that is published every year on degrowth, and it's like growing and growing, kind of like fun fact. So here I was looking, I have 4 books that were published last year. So I'll put them in the chat. Oh, it doesn't show really well, but these are 4 books that were published just last year. So this is the most recent publication in terms of books. And otherwise, you can also go on our website, actually, Degrowth.info. We have a library where you can find many literature. It can be videos, it can be articles, scientific papers. We have all kinds of stuff, and you can just put like a keyword, something that you're most interested in, and you'll find the related research.
Great. Okay, so Adam asks, a lot of climate activists, such as Greta Thunberg, are talking about degrowth ideas, but they don't use the word degrowth. Should there be greater pressure on activists and public figures to use that word, and how? That's the first part, and I'm going to add a little bit onto that. I'm going to add a question as to why emphasize degrowth as opposed to sort of this notion of just moving away from growth, like de-emphasizing growth versus degrowth, and the difference between those two, trying to sort of raise other things up to being as important. So first question, and I guess the key one is, should there be greater pressure on activists to use the word degrowth, and how?
Let's see, Nick is writing, so I'll start. I wouldn't use the word pressure, because I think the plurality is what is beautiful. And I think we're not aiming to have one word that describes the entire world. So I really don't mind like different activists using different words, as long as it is what defines them best, then that's perfect. And I think degrowth is a word that is a bit scary sometimes, and that's probably why politicians don't like to use that word so much. So for example, there was in 2018, there was a post-growth conference in Brussels at the European Parliament, and they wanted to use post-growth because that sounds a bit less radical than degrowth. So maybe I can just give a little insight on why we insist on the word degrowth. I think it is because this word cannot be taken and reinvented. It is, by definition, it is a word that is opposing to the current system. And degrowth does not want to be like taken into the system, such as, for example, words such as sustainable development could have been a different way of imagining the system, but in the end it was co-opted by the system. So degrowth is a way of assuming that this will not be the case for degrowth. So in the end, whether people call it this way or not, it is not that important for me, because as long as the idea is there, I think the plurality is what makes the world more interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Joëlle. Very well said. And I mean, just to underline that there is not the degrowth. It's not like with Marxism, you have like this compendium and you read that and then you have like a pretty general idea of what what Marxism is. It's not like that at all with degrowth. It's much more of a mosaic. So it's it's like Joëlle said, it's in many cases degrowth resonates with a lot of ideas that are out there and that are being lived and are being talked about without that label. And I just want to mention one more thing, which maybe also speaks a bit to your question, Bob. There is what is called the WellBeing Alliance. And the WellBeing Alliance actually integrates a lot of the criticisms and ideas that we just talked about, and it's actually on a government level. As far as I know, there's Scotland and New Zealand, and I think some other country that unite in the WellBeing Alliance, and there's a lot of outreach towards different groups of activists, NGOs, and scientists to come together to really think about what a future well-being oriented economy could look like. And there's also a book from 2018 by Catherine Trebeck and another person that really spells out this idea of a well-being economy.
Great. No, that's interesting. So Ken Kane from U of A here has a question, and he's asking, this is similar, but how do these different approaches, or how does the principles of degrowth relate or connect with the overall transition movement, the idea of sustainable transition?
Just to, could you specify, is it the transition initiative, or what is exactly meant by the transition movement?
Well, Ken writes the transition movement, so I'm just taking from that. I presume he means the overall effort to around transitioning the economy as opposed to focusing on degrowth.
Okay, so like a just transition that would englobe more movements or more ideas.
Yeah, that's how I read it.
Mm-hmm. So I have many different ideas. If you, like, I don't know exactly how to organize my thought. If Nick, you have an idea, you can go ahead. Oh, you mean the transition towns? Okay. So the transition towns have a lot to offer in terms of presenting a different way of organizing communities and neighborhoods and cities, and already organizing a transition. What is sometimes criticized by degrowth fellows on that movement is that they really focus on not being political and presenting themselves as something more neutral. It's like based on scientific facts. And I think degrowth for me is interesting in the sense that we cannot be neutral. There is no, like, everything is political. So when you take a stance of building a transition town, the actions that you will make there is a political perspective behind. So if pretending that it is neutral and that there is no politics involved is not true, because there is always a politic involved. Maybe Nick, you can, I feel like I haven't really expressed it so well. So.
No, I think that was perfect. I would really just like to stress that last point. I mean, we're talking to an academic community here, and I think it's worthwhile to mention that this idea of there is no unpolitical action also relates to research. So there's also no unpolitical research. So degrowth is really skeptical of that idea of having like a material rationalism of like that one truth that holds independently of the particular context that it operates in, and is looking much more at process rationality. So if this is something that you're interested in, I recommend you look up the term post-normal science, because that's the term that is being used in degrowth.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Leanne that asks, who is best to champion degrowth? Feminists, decolonizers, others, and how do these champions change the system? How can they start? Do they start in certain industries, or how do you start a movement and advance it?
Yeah, again, it's hard to give a definite answer to that question, because as we were trying to illustrate, it really is a question of a diversity, and I would not feel comfortable pointing to any particular group or person to kick this off, and also kicking it off, now that I say it, seems inadequate, because I feel like we're on the way already. Like within the past couple of years that I've been engaged with the movement, I feel like we've picked up so much momentum, and the interest from the general public, from research, from politics. I mean, Joëlle was mentioning that we had a conference on that in Brussels, so we were really targeting members of the European Parliament here, and I feel like this is happening on a lot of levels. It started out very academically. That's also one criticism that you can formulate on degrowth. But I feel like this is spreading out more and more to the political level and to the level of action. Yeah, maybe Joëlle, you want to add to that?
Yeah, as you just said, I think there is a lot of academic research on degrowth, and again, I think how to like concretely engage with this movement. This is personally something that I do every day in my way of living, in the way like where I'm working, and I know a lot of people are also engaging with those ideas without especially numbing. So this is degrowth. For example, here in Quebec, I'm working for a food initiative where it's a large group of 12,000 people. We gather. I mean, it is like, it's a complexity of how it's organized, but like we gather and decide together who we are buying from. So we make sure that the working conditions are respected, that it's organic, that it's bulk products, and so on. So we have like a number of things that we want to make sure to look for to know where is our food coming from. So this is for me a way of concretely engage with degrowth, but because this organism is still within the system, I don't think we can, like, just by itself, it cannot be degrowth, because degrowth is rethinking the entire system. So I think there are a lot of everything that is concretely counteracting the hegemonic power is already, not everything of course, but everything that is like going in the same sense as degrowth values, and that is concretely engaging with those values, I think is already a way of practicing degrowth, even if it's not called this way, because it is still embedded in the system in which we live.
Okay, well, we are now at 1 o'clock, so I want to thank you both for taking part and for your presentation today. It was very informative, and I'm sure that everyone learned a lot. I want to apologize for those of you who I didn't get to your questions, or if I skipped over them as I was managing the chat in this. You know, you could always feel free to reach out to Nick and Joëlle directly if you have some further questions. But thank you both very much, and thank everyone for attending. And have a great day, and we'll see you all later.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Goodbye.